Herkese günaydın. Sesim geliyor.
Good morning, everyone. You can hear me, right? Okay, great. Now, I prepared my presentation in English. We have foreign audience with us. I'll speak in Turkish. Now, economic growth. We'll talk about degrowth, and we'll criticize economic growth and the costs or the expenses of economic growth, etc. And we'll talk about the reasons behind the degrowth movement. But before that, before I tell you about the GDP, economic growth, etc., these are some of the definitions, or these are some of the words which will appear again and again. So I'd like to give you some definitions about what we mean by those. So I'd like to create a setting, or set the scene in a way. So economic growth, well, we have many problems in everyday life. These might be economic problems, or society-related problems. Well, the branch of economics approaches these problems from the perspective of growth. So problems are normal, you should continue growing, and as you get richer, these problems will be reduced. That is the message behind the science of economics. However, we see that the problems are not reduced, but it gets more and more, just like the Titanic. We grow our ships, and the icebergs grow in size too. So the threats keep on growing, and we still say, let's continue our growth, and we can still cruise faster in the Atlantic. Well, but this is not the way. So, is degrowth the panacea? I'm not really clear on that. Hopefully, by the end of the day, I'll be more clear on this. Now, in today's world, we know that we are experiencing certain problems. This sort of living is not sustainable. This sort of a life is not sustainable. Well, we should reduce our economic activities. We know what the future will look like, more or less. We can't continue like this forever. We have to revisit our economic activities. But what really interests me is how to get there. How to get from here to there. Maybe with my presentation, I might hopefully give you some data about how to do that, and then we'll discuss. Well, as I said, I'm seeing also some of my students from the faculty. I've already told them a lot. This is almost the end of the semester, and every year almost I talk to them about economic growth, the cost of economic growth. It will be repetition for them, for my students, but as I was telling you, in order to find a common platform, I find the definitions important. Now, what we call economic growth is the following. Economic growth is measured as a percentage change in the total output in a given period. Total output is the real GDP. And the real GDP is all the goods and services produced in a year, and the market value of all the goods and services produced in a year. So in order to calculate this, we do a correction or an adjustment, and then put it to percentage. You know, the economic growth was 5%, or it shrank by 5%, etc. So income per capita is the real GDP divided by the population. You can give this in various currencies, US dollar, Turkish lira. Until 2014, we gave this number based on the current dollar, like we called it $11,000, but Turkstat changed their idea, and they're looking at the purchasing parity capacity. So all of a sudden it has risen to 18,000 USD, the GDP per capita. So such tricks are also being used, but I'll tell you the real calculation, which is not very promising. Well, so in our society we are bundled with multiple problems. Some of them are ecological problems, others economic, and here's what the neoclassical economic model says. Yes, we have these problems. Unemployment is a problem. We have unequal distribution of income, and there's environmental degradation, but still wait and see, be patient, you continue your growth, and as you grow you'll see that things will again get back on track. So such promises date back to 1950s. Kuznets, for the first time in the US, says as the economy grows, the equal distribution also gets distorted. So then he makes a calculation. But once you have 10,000 USD per capita, then that unfair distribution of income will slowly start to decrease. So this is what was said in 1991, and then they came up with a Kuznets curve. Yes, then the carbon dioxide emissions, etc., increase, and there's an environmental quality reduction. Yes, but after you reach a certain amount, like 15,000 USD, we see that the environmental quality also increases. So they say, yeah, you continue your work, and the economic growth will correct all these things as you get richer. But looking at the empirical observations, etc., this is not what we see. And there are two things that we see here. One is the environmental problems, and the other is the distribution of income related issues. And there are other problems like workplace security or people's access to education and health services, poverty, unemployment, etc. So there is not an automated answer for these questions, as we see. Well, we talked about GDP, gross domestic product.
Gösterge, indikatör,
Now this indicator appears for the first time in 1929. The world faces the global depression, the Great Depression, as you know, and back then the economy's growth are measured in certain indicators or parameters, but there's a 50% collapse of the economy in the US. Unemployment rises to 25%, which continues for so many years, and the US cannot make sense of it, because so far there's the laissez-faire policy where, let the market take care of itself. Certain factories might close down, just like a tsunami wave hitting the shores, and some of the buildings will be collapsing, but that's fine, and that's even good, because we can make new buildings, so it will make room for newer buildings. So that's how people view the crises back then. So the tsunami wave has already hit the shore, but robust buildings do not emerge. So it starts in the 20s, the Great Depression, and then the World War breaks out in the 30s, and then if there were no military expenditures, then there would be no way out of this crisis, actually, and Keynes appears in this sort of setting. And back then they say we can no longer do the laissez-faire strategy, we have to intervene, but we need a parameter to intervene with it. So they go to Kuznets in 1934. They say to Kuznets, well, you go and have a look at it. We need an indicator to look at the total production, and Kuznets comes up with GDP. There you go, he says. But he also warns them, Kuznets. He says, well, I gave you a measurement, but do not use this GDP to check if the welfare of the people goes up or down.
Bu krizler artıyor, ekonomik, sosyal krizler, en son
So the crisis grows, the last one being the 2008 crisis, and then it all boils down to one thing: we must be doing something wrong because so many crises have hit us, people say. The indicators that we use when we're devising our policies, are they really right? People start to think. And against GDP, there is a stance. Well, I could not hold myself back. The most poetic critique comes from Robert Kennedy in 1968. Here's what he says, back in 1968 even. He says, we use something that is called GDP. We build all our policies on this. Think about AKP, for example, Justice and Development Party from Turkey, and they have a goal, 2023 goals, and this focuses on a certain GDP, which will be $25,000 per capita. That will be the income. So we are at a deadlock just because of this reason. But anyway, we'll come to that later. So Kennedy says, okay, we're using this thing called GDP to make our economic policies, our social policies, etc. But this thing that we call GDP actually measures everything except that which is worthwhile. I mean, all the things which makes us lose value are part of GDP, and the things that add value to us are out of it, like volunteerism. That's not part of it. Like many of us here are working on a voluntary basis, or you're not getting paid for it, or you have the housewives, for example, or caretakers taking care of children or the elderly. They're not making any money, but they're increasing people's welfare, but still this does not play into GDP. But when the government buys pepper gas or gives a water cannon vehicle, for example, then this goes into GDP, but this does not increase our prosperity in any means. Well, so there are the economists, and there's the economics discipline. So how do we define it? So what should the economists be doing? Neoliberal view, so the main branch of economics, sees economics as the science of allocating scarce resources to endless human needs. Human needs are endless, but unfortunately the resources on Earth are scarce, so we should somehow allocate the resources with the needs. So the price mechanism comes into play. Whoever pays more should also have access to the resources, so he who pays the piper should get it, they say. So this is how they have decided that only then can the scarce resources be allocated to the endless human needs. But the heterodox view says economics' main aim is the well-being of human beings. Well, a professor at the school translated this word well-being differently. So there are two different words for it used in Turkish, and please keep these two words in mind, because people like me, economists, actually do what they're doing in order to improve humans' well-beings. And what is part of the well-being? There are materialistic and non-materialistic dimensions. Of course, income per capita is very important, and we need to make some expenditures.
Fakat bunların hepsi de hani bizim
and we need some income, but all these things do not mean that we are in a state of well-being. We might have a job, but are we satisfied with it? That is also important. Or safety or security is important. Work and private life balance is important. Then how you enjoy life, like Dilovası, Kocaeli, are very important regions. Dilovası has the highest income in Turkey, but if you would ask a mother in that region, nobody would say, oh, I am living the most prosperous life in Turkey. Nobody would say that. A study made by Hamzaoğlu showed that there were heavy metals in the breast milk of the mothers living in that region. So,
bir iktisatçı olarak
well, so what should we expect from economists? One thing that I particularly pay attention to is the following. We should inform the policy-making process with the work that we're doing. We should conduct studies, and the policy makers should have a look at these and decide what sort of policies they should devise. And these policies should increase the total wealth of the people. I mean, for me, increasing GDP to 25,000 USD is not sufficient. The aim should be the gross national happiness should be increased 25 points, for example, in Turkey. Not gross national product, but gross national happiness. So what sort of an indicator should we use then? As I said, GDP has many problems, so it's not really an appropriate indicator. Okay. What sort of a world are we part of? And if we continue like this, what sort of a future is waiting ahead? This is our ecological footprint. And down below, in the middle, the dotted line is one world. Now we have only one world. And in this one world, we have the fishes, we have the trees, we have the soil, we have the air, etc. And we know the capacity presented to us with this only one world. That is called biocapacity. So, our only one world offers us certain biocapacity. But in a year, we're using 1.5 worlds of resources. And if we continue like this, in 2030, only 2 worlds will suffice for us in a year. Which means the forests grow 10% in a year, but if the forest stays the same, then we should just consume 10%, but we are consuming or chopping 20% of the forests, which lowers the amount of the trees and the fishes, etc. And we run out of the stock. So the 2 earths will be used. So if we can drop our carbon emissions by 30%, just like was said in Paris, by the year 2030, then a door of hope will appear, actually. And those figures down below will show us that on the 28th of June we'll almost have consumed all the Earth's resources, but if we have the 30% reduction, then by 16th of December that won't be the case. So if we have only one Earth, then we should consume only, as though it was one Earth. So we should think of degrowth, because we cannot continue like this. We should really reduce our economic activities. So these problems and GDP approach, etc., present certain shortcomings. And Bhutan's king in 1972, who had studied in Oxford, who is really well equipped in terms of philosophy. I have only 5 minutes left. He speaks so many languages, etc. So this king of Bhutan says, well, I'm not going to use GDP anymore when I'm policy making. I'll use GNH, which is gross national happiness. For me, it's not important how much the income rises, happiness should rise. So I will increase the gross national happiness, he said. And of course, this created certain repercussions, and people come up with different alternatives to GDP, like Human Development Index. I'll show you how Turkey is doing in those indices, and it is totally a fiasco, by the way. Well, anyway, so with a graduate student of mine, we worked on this, and we were awarded the best graduate award because of his or her work. My student did everything, and he was awarded for the work that he did by an institute. Well, how is Turkey doing? Out of 184 countries, Turkey is in the 61st place, so in the 1/3 at least. But 2 days ago at Bosphorus University, Human Development Index was announced, and Turkey has now regressed to the 72nd place from 69th, and Happy Planet Index, Turkey ranks 44, and at the OECD Better Life Index we are in the last place, 36th place out of 36 countries, which is not a surprise. Okay, what have we done? We have actually copied Bhutan. The king of Bhutan also talked to people and asked them what was important to them, etc. And I was really surprised, because Turkstat also has this life satisfaction survey since 2003. They ask about 300 questions. They've asked about 7,000 people, and in 2013 the survey was conducted in the city level with 196,000 people. Sinop was the happiest, and we're building nuclear power plant there, and Tunceli appeared to be the unhappiest city. Blah blah. So now we are calculating an index. We say GDP does not measure human well-being in a good way, so we want to have different domains of life, etc. And here's what we see. Now in green down below you see the GDP per capita and how it changed. In 2004 it was like 1,225 TL per capita, and in 2013 it rose to 1,650. It's not a bad increase at all. It's like almost like 35%, almost 40% increase in GDP per capita. But how about the subject to well-being? It did not really contribute to that. We've gone through such a growth path that the materialistic growth actually has not added much to our real well-being, not significantly at least. Now, and we see the reasons behind it. Under this growth, there's a lot of environmental degradation, etc. So this is from Turkey. Blue shows our ecological footprint, and the red shows our natural resources, the biocapacity presented to us, the more this gap grows, the more unsustainable a country's policies are. So this is not only ecological, there are also social consequences. Now, ILO data on fatal workplace accidents, quarries, mines, etc. We have the data until 2012. I wanted to update the information. I went to the Ministry of Labor and Occupational Social Security website, and they've said, well, because of the omnibus package which was passed then and then, there was a ban on announcing or publishing the fatal accident data which have taken place in workplaces. But we know that more than 1,800 people have died in the mines only in the year 2011. 301 of them died in Soma. So the Soma mine accident was the best example of that, actually. This shows actually why this economic growth path matters and why it doesn't contribute to our well-being. So in order to hit the Vision 2023 targets, we need more energy, and we are dependent on foreign resources, so we give subsidies to local coal, and we do not care about occupational regulations whatsoever. People die in a mine, so they want to build a thermal power plant, but we try to build this power plant right next to a mine, and in a year just 6,000 olive trees are chopped down, etc. These things do not make much sense. Okay, then what can be done? This economic growth path obviously does not make people happy. Is another path possible? I'll tell you about two studies. The first one was conducted by Erinç et al. Now, here they compare two policies. If Vision 2023 policies continue, what would happen to Turkey? They look at GDP, they look at employment. Employment is also an important indicator, and they look at pollution. And Erinç also says, okay, let's introduce just a carbon tax, and with the income, let's invest in green job creation, and then what sort of a Turkey will we have by the year 2030? It will be a much greener, a much higher employment with much less pollution. So we do not have to grow this way. An alternative path actually would give us a more livable Turkey, actually. Okay, now this is from the Technical University, my good friend İpek İlkkaracan, Tolga Kaya, and Kim have made this study, and they have published it in 2015 in the month of August. They look at the public contribution of social care services, because the public sector has an important financial power. They collect taxes and then they invest. Which sectors do they contribute to? That is important. So the people here in this survey ask the following question. In preschool education, right now kids already go to school at the age of 4 or 5, right? Actually, this is a big social policy. Why? Because at an early age you get to have your child go to school, so the mom can go back to a working life, etc. And she can participate in the working life, and this will reduce poverty, etc. Now, in order to catch OECD average, Turkey needs to invest 2.7 billion TL more preschool education. Now, when this is the case, what happens? Well, what will happen if you invest this amount to a preschool education versus to the construction sector, for example? It's a very formal model. And here's the outcome. If you spend 20 billion TL to the preschool education, then you actually create more employment and more women can work in those areas actually. Mostly women can work there. Then you can employ mostly poor people, so you can actually reduce the level of poverty in a country, and you can have many good things with one go. So the government, are they making policies to make things get better or to make things get more out of hand? Well, okay, I have really exceeded my time. We can discuss these things later. Thank you very much for your attention.